The events of the morning came back to you with clarity. She was the reason he'd been so distracted. You watched the team cautiously. Nico had completely frozen after managing to get the device out of his deep pocket. What do I do? Answer it, was George's plain reply. It was perfectly reasonable, and the only other option beside not answer it. Unfortunately, that was a bit of a common sense, was no help to Nico. His breathing was rapid, and the phone shook in his hands. Derek, you give advice. Derek, you give advice. You've got more experience liking somebody than me. I only found one less than a year ago. Wait. More experience liking somebody? Really? Derek, do you have more experience liking somebody? In most cases, Derek was the first to jump at solving a problem, but he'd pretended not to see that whole scene, at least until he'd forcibly been thrown into the event by George's straightforwardness. George! You knew that glower. Derek's brother was threatening to send him to an early grave again. This is not the time. How can I tell anyone else how to handle romance well? I'm always choked when I tried talking to my crush. Really? Oh yeah. Well, the brains and brawn can't be denied for the trio, but your one weakness is clear. None of you boys can woo to save your life. She is not my crush. As much of a mess Nicholas had dissolved into, he was still together enough to set that misunderstanding straight. He was so offended, his voice cracked. She's a psychic. I've been on her waitlist for months. A psychic? Then just answer. George reasserted his suggestion, this time with an extra dose of obviously in the undertone. There was no reason to hesitate as far as he could see. It had to be done. Nico bit his lip, twisted his face away from the screen, and for good measure, squeezed his eyes shut. Finally, he tapped the answer. Hello? A small, high-pitched voice was on the other line. You knew that it sounded like what it sounded like because you heard it yourself. His phone was on speaker. Nico realized with horror. Everyone else was forced to be aware of it as well. Is this Nicholas Suarez? It's Miss Cala. I'm calling all the way from the St. Sarabel boarding school to tell you the future. Give me a 10 and you'll know what to do then. I don't remember Cala. Her catchphrase was well rehearsed and full of approachability. Cala was there to serve. But Nicholas only managed a squeak and fumbled to turn the speaker off without hanging up. Liz didn't have a similar struggle. She couldn't stop herself from voicing a thought aloud and entering the conversation. I've heard that before. St. Sarabel. What do you mean? Who are you? Rather than replying the queries lobbed at her, Liz instead delightfully declared the answer to a mystery that had been in only her head. Ah, that's where Shiloh attended high school. I think he was also there for part of the middle school, but that's besides the point. Ooh, I am also loving the Shiloh name drop, even though I don't think we're going to see him at all. I do appreciate Shiloh's presence in this one. Oh, you know a fellow SS Bite? What's his last name? I can, maybe if the stars align, tell you about his future. Fields. Shiloh Fields. Nico only watched helplessly. He couldn't cut Cala off by changing the phone setting now, but words weren't working well enough for him to explain that she did not have to chat with Liz. Either unaware of or pointedly avoiding Nicholas' estate, Liz bulldozed ahead. His name is Shiloh Leon Fields, but don't strain yourself to come up with something. He's 22 and graduated from that school years ago. I imagine you won't have much to say about that. That breakdown of the situation was punctuated by a snort from Liz. Miss Cala came right back with a scoff of her own. Before she even spoke, you got the impression Liz had met a challenger in smugness. I do know Shiloh Fields. He's got those huge eyes, freckles, and all those hats. Yeah, that's him. I've always lived in this town. I didn't always go to SSB, but I was right nearby when he first moved in. So there, I know him and his whole group. They're infamous. Huh. For all her normal snark, your sister was speechless. She didn't even try to further compete. You couldn't blame her. A random psychic the little brother of your longtime friend happened to call was familiar with another of your childhood playmates. Whether it was luck, chance, fate, or pure coincidence, it was definitely odd. Really? What can you tell us about Shiloh? Wait, Liz, what about that guy who yelled at Shiloh and us? You stayed out of that particular conversation. What can you tell us about Shiloh? Because I am curious. Cala didn't bother asking who you were. Your question got an instant reaction. Nothing! Not anymore! That's one guy I can't say anything about! Or perhaps I'm psychic because I called that. Excuse me, old lady, he is a mystery beyond even my powers. That's not my fault. And how do you know I'm old? I can tell. No more explanations needed, clearly. Liz sighed and quietly reprimanded herself. She mumbled under her breath about how the psychic was obviously a kid and she couldn't be rude. But anyway, the only good thing about Shiloh is that he's friends with Bay. Who is that? What? Only the smartest and most beautiful man in the world. If you knew Shiloh, how come you don't know the guy who was considered enough to be his friend and roommate at the boarding school? Because Shiloh never mentioned this friend before. The professional psychic scoffed openly at this piece of info she'd been unaware of. I predict that Shiloh never brought it up, because maybe you would have wanted to meet him, and then all of you would end up liking Bei more. And my prediction is also that Bei Pyeon is receiving a great education and is still handsome and still nice and is way better than Shiloh. Cala chirped again in her normal girlish tone, satisfied with the job well done. There you are, a whole reading specifically for you. Thank you for your wisdom, Cala. Does it count as a prediction if you talk about their current life? It's honestly pretty nice to know what's going on. Can I get a refund? So you're following him online, right? You teased. Alright. So you're following him online, right? You teased. No! Something about that particular shout got through to Nicholas. He blinked out of the stun lock he'd been stuck on for an entire conversation and stuck up a fast and full breath. Sorry about that, Cala. It's me, Nicholas Suarez. I'm here. Oh, I almost forgot why I was calling somebody. You're the real client. What do you want to ask about? It'd be nice to know why this is happening so late. I thought it was going to be in the morning. Sorry? She said, not sounding sorry even a tiny bit. Oh, sorry, she said, not sounding sorry even a tiny bit. My big brother Chand visited and he's more important than you. Oh, there wasn't much Nico could say against that retort, though he still couldn't stop himself from looking sour. He learned how it felt to be on the receiving side of such an attitude and didn't appreciate the taste of humble pie. Both Derek and George guiltily chuckled on the sidelines at such a display of karma. Hey! The voice coming through Nicholas's phone remained unapologetic, but a spark of genuine interest in the present returned to the self-described future seer. That's what you wanted to talk about. You've got a big brother too. Miss Cala didn't practice the concept of client privacy. That was the second harsh lesson Nicholas got in a matter of minutes. He slapped a hand against one eye and hurried to end the call before any further education on life's displeasure could be taught. It's cool, forget it. I hope you have a very good day. Tell Chand I said hi. He doesn't know who you are. Goodbye forever! From his face at the phone, Nicholas smacked his fingers against the screen to end the psychic connection. That was pretty random, but still kind of entertaining. Especially with the Shiloh shoutout, even though we didn't really get much about it. With a deep sigh, Nicholas's whole torso slumped over. He went low enough that his hands almost scraped the floor. The encounter had deflated him. What was that about? George posed the question out of simple curiosity. He didn't give a hint of judgment or suspicion, but Nicholas reacted as if George asked where the last cookie went to his crumb-covered little brother. Nothing. It was about nothing. The total shutdown took George by surprise. He frowned. The biggest brother off the bunch took that as a sign to step in with a soft smile and almost parental words. Well, Nico can have his fun. We've all wondered about what might happen in the future. George's usual placidity returned after a shrug. He could accept that Nicholas didn't appreciate any attempt at prying and focused on chatting with Derek about his own manners.
No.
I haven't. I'm not sure I want to know. Realizing everything about me and everyone else was entirely set to the point where each move could be predicted would make the world feel almost pointless, even if it was a good future. But what if it was a bad one? That'd be even worse. I'm convinced. I definitely don't want to hear about my future. George nodded to himself mainly. He'd reasoned it all out, and that chapter of the conversation could be closed. Until a low murmur came from the still drooping figure of Nicholas that left an ugly wrinkle across the page. It's easy for you to say. He hadn't been trying to join into the conversation, yet made it crystal clear it wasn't a topic up for discussion. Yet Nicholas was agitated enough about whatever it was to voice the contempt. What's that supposed to mean, Nicholas? Free of suspicion was no longer a description that applied to George's words. They were dripping in it. George's attention now on him, Nicholas coolly peered at his brother between the long, thick strands of hair that dangled in front of his eyes. He didn't speak. Derek's characteristic grin strained under the rising tension he'd attempted to sidestep. He clapped his hands together and made another go at shifting focuses.
That's a bummer.
Nicholas really is getting older. He sighs a lot more nowadays, huh? The weight of the world is starting to get him. That sucks, but there's no avoiding it as you grow up. Derek succeeded in getting George's icy stare pointing his way instead, but it didn't last. George watched him intently, only long enough to read what he could from his older brother's acts and deeds. Then he came to some kind of conclusion. At that point, the middle Suarez turned again to Nicholas. He didn't look at him, it was through him. He didn't look at him, it was through him. Some things don't change even when you're older. George didn't grit his teeth or shout. There was a lack of feeling, a disconnectedness that was even worse than anger would have been. Nicholas' fingers tightened into fists, and he sprung right up. He stared into his brother's face defiantly. He shook with an impotent rage George lacked. George had been looking down on him, and easily still could even at Nicholas's full height. That added an extra sting to what the younger Suarez said next. You know what sucks more than growing up? Being the last to grow up. I'm the one who gets left behind. I'm basically an only child now. It's just me and mom and dad at home. The flash of fury burned out quick. Nicholas began to crumble with every cracking sentence.
Not fair.
And the worst part is, I'm probably just being annoying, right? The spoiled baby of the family who's always crying for attention. Of course, adults have to go out and do their adult things. It's dumb to think people could do anything else, so I can't even talk about it with anybody. Nicholas's plight devastated Derek. He was ready to move heaven and earth to solve the conundrum of aging if he could. But George's features didn't so much as twitch. Did you really not tell anyone? It was a callousness that left Derek speechless. He couldn't stop the days from going by, and he couldn't even stop his younger brothers from being mad at each other. And the interesting thing about this conversation is, what Nicholas is feeling is 100% valid. Totally valid. But what I'm anticipating is happening here, or at least what the brothers are thinking, is that it's not all ponies and rainbows when you're the oldest, or when you're in the middle child either. I feel like no matter what, whether you're the oldest or the youngest or stuck in between, there are definitely pros and cons, ups and downs. Things are amazing and things that just plain suck, no matter what. Just to put in, again, not to invalidate at all his feelings, but just saying, like Nicholas is. There's a lot of perks to being the youngest too. There's a lot of perks to really any situation virtually, but Nicholas and George Suarez glared at one another unflinchingly. And what is that supposed to mean, George? You told Derek, didn't you? He knew how you felt, and I bet he knows what the call was about. What else would you have been talking about by the pool? You can always talk to Derek, only him. George had said it all without saying it. He was accusing Nicholas of loving Derek more than him, and George hated that. Boom! I am happy that George also spoke up and stood up for himself. Boom, thank you. I saw that too, actually. Well, am I right? The staring contest ended right there as Nicholas hung his head down, dropping his glance to the floor. That was only a battle. The war wasn't over yet. You're so smart and somehow not smart at all. Unaffected by the insult but instinctively frustrated from the lack of a real answer, George once again looked at Derek. Derek's mouth had continued to hang open in horror, but he finally closed it. He too turned his gaze away from the middle child. He didn't have any words to offer that time. George stood there between his two silent brothers, futilely turning from one to the other. They were crowded together in the same space but seemed to be so far away. Ultimately, it was the lack of response that George took as an answer. All alone, right next to the ones he had cared about most, George whispered bitterly. I knew it. The suffocating stillness exploded. Nicholas wasn't finished. You don't know. I know there's no need having three of us around. Derek is more than enough for everybody. Shots were fired back and forth with no ground gain on either side. I was literally 6 when I obsessed over Derek. You can get over it already. I'll get over it as soon as you do. Nicholas thrust his arms out wide, caught up in the heat of the feud. The need to take George down, he sacrificed the secret he'd held on to so tightly. Well, guess what, George? I did tell Derek about that call. That means he can tell you all about how I never even mentioned him to the stupid psychic. I have 2 older brothers, not just him. I haven't forgotten that, even though you're so sure I have. When I asked for the reading, Derek was already long gone. I wasn't going to demand the universe bring him back. He had better things to do. Hey, that's not... Derek instinctively spoke out against the idea that his family was such a low priority, but managed to hold his tongue. I kind of want to hear George and Nico just lay it out there. Like, lay all the cards out there, because I feel like this is something that's been brewing for a while, and at some point they're gonna have to, like, address it. So if these three brothers have any chance of really being able to fully become, like, true brothers with no baggage, they have to just feel what they feel and express and communicate what they feel. Even if it's not logical, even if it's purely emotional, just do it. Just do it. This was between Nicholas and George. Neither could even see Derek amid their mutual misdirected hurt. I wanted to ask how much longer I'd at least have you nearby. Maybe you'd go away after college, or maybe you'd stay here. I didn't know. But you might have felt bad if I asked you directly in case you were gonna leave. I didn't want to hold you back from going for whatever life you had in mind, with or without me around. And that's the only reason it was easier to admit to Derek, so there. Nico's arms were folded defiantly as he mimicked the snide closing remark the psychic used to tell Liz off. However, nothing about him came across as truly satisfied. He had to twist his face away to try hiding how glossy his eyes were. Nicholas couldn't avoid the throat-clenching emotion in his voice. George was completely floored. Shock, sorrow, and relief fought for the control over his face. It contorted with deep creases. You understood then why Derek had kept quiet about what had happened. It wasn't his place to admit something like that on Nico's behalf. Yeah, Derek was very smart to do that. After a pained stretch of silence, the feeling that settled in George's heart was an Olympic-sized pool of regret. Nicholas, I'm so sorry. It was a struggle for George to speak. He swallowed thickly, his Adam's apple bobbing. He didn't try to cover how watery his eyes had become. You were right about me, and I was wrong about you. I haven't gotten over the memory of being the odd man out, even though it was years ago. That's not fair. None of it has been. I think this is why me and George, I'd like to say, in-game, became close, is because maybe I was one of those people who actually paid attention to him. It's very easy for the middle child, especially if there are three kids specifically, if there are three children, it's easy for the middle child to sort of like get lost in that. But I guess it also is easy for any middle children. Like, no matter, I feel like the larger the family, the more kids you have in the middle, the easier it is for all of the middle children to sort of get lost too. So yeah, being in the middle is not that great either. George looked at the sky, getting lost in its great expanse as his mind sank deep into the past. You and Derek have to have moments that are only for the two of you. We're not a set. We're individual people, and we have our own relationships. Though to me, it's always still felt as if there's more moments of Nicholas and Derek than any other. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, as a third party person, as a, completely like unbiased third party person, it kind of looks like that too. It really does. When I was a kid, I never thought I could win. You were clear about whose company you were looking for. I didn't want to make things awkward by being a third wheel, and mostly I didn't want to test the water to see how much I was welcome between you and Derek. I was too afraid that I wouldn't be. It was better to tell myself I didn't need to be part of it. His eyes and hands squeezed shut. George was unable to face his brother directly. He still forced himself to continue. But as much as I counted myself out, I wanted to be included. I wanted you to say George was back. George was back when I showed up, or that you wouldn't go somewhere if I wasn't coming too. I wish I had admitted that a long time ago. The stiffness over George's whole form released after he said his truth. His fist unclenched. The shining earth green eyes could be seen again. He let go for real. Now, if I was being honest, both of these brothers legitimately have pain. If I was to pick somebody that I would sympathize more, slightly, if I'm being 100% honest, it's still George. I still feel that George got the shorter end of stick here because yeah, like the struggle is real for Nicholas, but he still got to spend a lot of time with his hero Derek. He still got to, you know, as a kid, I think he really was treated differently from his other siblings because he was the youngest. I think there were things that his parents seemed to do that were, I'm just going to say it, kind of special treatment to him because he was the youngest that they probably did not do in a similar way to George. So between these two, I do slightly lean towards feeling more sympathy towards George's situation because George was just kind of like, he was the third man out. Derek has his issues, definitely. Nicholas has his issues, definitely. But at least Nicholas and Derek, they had each other. And George, just like, he had Derek, but Nicholas certainly seemed to have Derek more. Like, and Nicholas certainly appeared to spend more. Between Derek and George, Nicholas seemed to have, George seemed to have more Derek seemed to have more Nicholas time versus George. Whether Derek wanted it that way or not, it still was a thing. So, yeah. But again, I'm not invalidating that Nicholas, of course, is hurting from this too. But, again, trying to be as unbiased as possible. Trying to be. The grass is always greener, basically. The grass is always greener. So, the stiffness over George's whole form released after he said his truth. His fists unclenched, the shining earth-green eyes could be seen again. He'd let go for real. While George was a pillar of peace, his brother was the opposite. Nicholas vigorously scrubbed at his face, transferring tears and snot onto his bare arms rather than his face. When he could at least pretend he'd pulled himself together, Nicholas spoke again with absolute conviction. I'm sorry I ever treated you like that. Back then and still now, all I think about is how I feel on stuff. Obviously, it was easy for me to move on as if it was nothing, because I was the one getting my way. It was easy for me to move on as if it was nothing, because I was the one getting my way. I stopped wanting it to be that way, and that was my closure. But now you're the ones having a good time while I'm watching on the sidelines. There's barely a place for me anymore. That's gonna change, Nicholas. That's the thing. He doesn't know that. He's a teenager. I get it. He's a teenager. He doesn't know any better. Give it another 5 years. That's gonna change very quickly. Trust me. That's not gonna be a big deal anymore. There's barely a place for him. Yeah. That's very temporary. Trust me, Nicholas. I really know how it feels, and instead of maybe getting some sympathy, I really know how it feels, and instead of maybe getting some empathy, I still only thought about me and needed everyone else to care. There we go. There's that subconscious tendency to feel like, you know, that they're entitled. Subconsciously, they're entitled a little bit, which can be a thing for the youngest person in a group of siblings. So I have heard. I'm not a psychiatrist, obviously, or a psychologist. These are just things that I've heard and that I presume. Again, speaking as someone who is the oldest sibling, not the youngest sibling. Because, you know, if you were quote unquote spoiled or just treated differently because you were the youngest, it's hard not to expect. Maybe it's not so much entitled, but you just expect certain things. You kind of expect for things to go your way sometimes. And I think that's where this is challenging. This is what's challenging for him. Sorry, George, I guess I got what was coming with this. That conclusion brought a disagreeable frown to George's face. He looked over the youngest through a narrowed, serious gaze, but the firmness was founded on affection. It was unmistakable then. George wasn't simply a middle child. He was an older brother, all along, in his own way, And even when Nicholas couldn't see it, he always
No.
had been. Nicholas, no you didn't. You were in elementary school, remember? Why should you be punished for that? Besides, you're not giving yourself enough credit. Me and Derek did what we wanted to do with your support. It's been years since you've put your feelings over ours. Going to college, moving out, growing up at different times, it brings separation. But abandoning you isn't what you deserve. And even if you did, I wouldn't be glad over it happening anyway. I don't care about fairness. I'm biased. George's brows stayed pinched, but he lost the air of a teacher schooling their misguided student. The warmth of his affection was too apparent. Above all else, my family should get as much good as they can get. My family should get as much good as they can, even if it means they're spoiled sometimes. They should be spoiled. They should be spoiled.
Worry.
And that sentiment goes double for my little brother. Derek might have too, but don't forget either, Nico. You're the only one I've got in the whole world. Nicholas's tears went unwiped. They were free to roll down his face while he shouted as loud as his lungs could manage. I love you, George. When you decided to pick a college nearby, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. It's great when we work on those way too big puzzles together and play the weirdest games you can find. I'd never want to lose that, even though I know you can't hang around here for the rest of your life. I want you to keep coming back. I'm grateful every time you come through the door. George's lips trembled. His blinking was rapid. For someone as reserved as him, it was a display of emotion, no lesser than Nico's heartfelt declaration. Has Liz just been watching this whole time? I'm like, is Liz just kind of awkwardly... Liz is probably just like completely distancing herself from this conversation, is just soaking some rays. That's what I'm thinking. I don't want to lose you either. I love you. Sheepishly, George lifted his arms from his sides. It was small, subtle gesture. He didn't even bring them all the way up, but he took the initiative to reach out. Nicholas didn't need any more of a sign than that. He bounded ahead and jumped into his big brother's chest. George's long-held fears of rejection were shattered for good. It took a second to get over the emotional and physical stun of Nicholas's hold, but soon George reciprocated. The two embraced one another fully, with nothing left standing in between. Beautifully well done. And I'm really glad that Derek, and really me too, like me and Derek, we both just kind of stayed out of it. Like, we just let the two brothers figure it out amongst themselves. Because if we had interfered, then the authenticity of them making up, the authenticity would have been in question. So I really like that they did plow through, and that the rest of us gave them the space and the respect to just work it out, you know. They were there, they were left in peace to have that. But once it was over and the two young men began to part, the piece missing from their brotherly bonding took a step forward. I'm sorry too. The unexpected statement got immediate laughter from the recipients. George and Nicholas threw their heads back and stayed unified with an arm over the other's shoulders. What did you even do? For those two, nothing was more of a joke than Derek, Mr. Responsibility, the perfect guest Suarez needing to apologize. Derek scratched at the back is his head. There's a lot of... The game is great, but I am still catching a few grammatical things here and there. Derek scratched at the back of his head, accepting his turn as a third wheel. He might be awkward over butting in, but Derek absolutely meant what he said. I did way too much of the wrong things, and not nearly enough of the right things. Yeah, that's exaggerating, Derek. You're being a little overdramatic there. That's a little too... That's a bit of an 11, Derek. Take it back to like an 8, at least. At least dial it back to an 8. I'm the one who insisted on handling Nico all the time because I didn't want to ask for help and because I saw myself as the only big brother of the family. My overinflated sense of importance and martyrdom is what took away any space for George. He's got a point. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with Derek there. He did sort of enable that a little bit. Like, with good intentions. There was good intentions behind it, and it was honorable, but in this specific situation, certainly added to it, contributed to it. But that was only when I thought there was something I needed to handle. If everything was fine, I wasn't there at all. I was too busy with school and practice trying to prove myself. Neither of you are to blame for how everything went down. You had to be demanding to get my attention, or you had to stay out of my way.
I really messed up.
Oh, jeez, Derek, don't say that. I should have been there, not more, but I should have been there, not more, but better, and let you have each other too. The least I can do is apologize.